I do apologize, but I've done something really stupid, which was agree to speak somewhere else, but very soon. I want really to say something, just very briefly, about Vertigo. One of the advantages of choosing the movie Vertigo is that I can assume that everyone has seen it probably many, many more times than once. So I don't feel that I'm introducing some obscure little-known film where I'd have to give you an account of the plot. I want to make some points about Vertigo which rest on the question of space, architecture, and film. But in a kind of slightly indirect way. I'll try and put it very, very briefly. The first point is that, oddly, Vertigo is actually two films. I mean, two films in the sense that we have, from the beginning of the film, until really the entry into a hospital of Scotty, a kind of melodrama. And it's a melodrama which produces very much, especially like in film theory, I would call like old-fashioned Freudian interpretation, governed by a slightly naive view of what Freud called the Oedipus complex. The second film, in a way, is, in some sense, an analysis of the first film. Although it has a kind of plot consistency with the first, it's about the fact that you, as the viewer, the moment you have seen Kim Novak stroke Madeleine, as now this girl from Kansas working in San Francisco, you're soon introduced into her point of view, which is that the whole of the first half of the film has been a ghoulish manipulation of Scotty, and in fact was a way of enabling the character who was with Madeleine, this rather mysterious figure who commissioned Scotty to follow his so-called wife. He's given this extraordinary role of having spun a kind of plot, literally. I mean, it's not just the plot of the movie, it's a plot to trap James Stewart into a kind of web about his vertigo and the death of what he takes to be Madeleine, who is not dead, but dumped by her plotter, is now working, and he sees her, and she seems to him actually not to be Madeleine, but to look rather like Madeleine. The second half of the film involves his attempt not to lose his neurosis, but to keep hold of it by making her more and more like the image of Madeleine in the first half of the film. And at the same time, he gradually, slowly develops the power to think, or you might say detect, which he does at the very end of the film. Now, I'm trying to point out that this second half is both a sort of deconstruction of melodrama, but also implicitly a critique of the simple-minded version of the Oedipus complex, which is supported and enabled by the first half of the film. There's also something, but I'll just let it wait till the end. I think there are a whole series of architectural jokes in the film, which perhaps haven't gone noticed. Central to the first half of the film, of his capture not only by Madeleine, but his capture, the way he walks into the plot, quite literally, is this strange way that he walks so fluently into it that kind of we follow him. I mean, the plot, if you look at it, is just frankly absurd. But I've never felt any difficulty, following it as completely fluent. I mean, what are we talking about? Some man rather mysteriously says we were chums at school, though Scotty doesn't seem to remember that. That's odd. He set off pursuing my wife on an insane journey that his wife is in fact identifying with this strange woman, Carlotta Valdez, from the 19th century. And the whole thing is at one level a complete farrago. But even the audience, I suggest, I mean, we do it so fluently, we don't seem to question this. There where we don't question things, you can tell, the unconscious is working. Now, let's try and refine it round to his symptom. His symptom, apparently, is given in the title, Vertigo. The word's not used. What's used in the movie is the word acropophobia. Acropophobia. In a sense, the fear of being in a high place. Not exactly a fear of heights, but there being something about a certain kind of space. It comes up very quickly. You're given at the very beginning of the film an actual one of several occasions, which is the central space related to the vertigo stroke acropophobia. He's hanging from a rooftop and clearly is becoming overwhelmed by a sort of crisis, manifesting itself as fear. The space we look down, I mean, you should be looking down just to the ground from the roof of a building, but it always has, strangely, it being like almost an enclosed space. And you have this shot, which we'll take up again in a moment. This shot, this famous shot, or the famous way of making this shot, which comes up again in the Spanish church, the mission church. Let's just think about the shot for a moment. If you look at a popular kind of source of the discussion of this, it's in Truffaut's interviews with Hitchcock, in which Hitchcock says, I think I was playing around for 15 years trying to get this shot. It's a shot where the camera zooms, but the camera physically tracks back. I mean, moves back. It gives us this strange sensation as a spectator of going like in and out at the same time. it is a very strange experience, and it's obviously, this shot is a kind of representation of the essence of Scotti's Vertigo. Now, this Vertigo, what can we say in support of it being Oedipal? Well, the first thing to say is it's happened before. I mean, as with any neurosis, it's repeating itself, it's replaying itself. When he follows Madeleine, some of this begins to uncover itself. She has been instructed to lead him on a ghost hunt, whatever you call it, mad day of going from place to place, in which the film brilliantly both is teaching us more about the symptom, his symptom, but also unfurling the story of Carlotta Valdez, the woman who Madeleine increasingly identifies with. She goes to, I think it's called Podesta, the flower shop. She lays the flowers on Carlotta Valdez's grave. Then we go very crucially to the, I think it's the Palace of the Legion of Honor, or no, what is it? Something of honor. It's not really a gallery, but in the film it is. Where she is wrapped. Madeleine, she's sitting in the gallery, and the poor victim of this plot, Scotty, James Stewart, kind of watches her from the edge. She is studying the portrait of Carlotta Valdez. And in a scene that's actually very uncharacteristic of Hitchcock's cinematography, he kind of leads the spectator almost on a little pedagogic point. You concentrate on the coif of hair on the back of the mother's head, and then, rather pedagogically, Carlotta Valdez has the same. There is this identity insisted upon on the hair. Now, I'm making the crude Freudian interpretation, which I don't actually agree with, but it's very easy to reconstruct it. At this point, you would say, with a kind of Freudian mastery, that's it. It's the coif of hair. The hair is the space. I have very little time, so I'm going to have to really cut to the chase. So forgive me for adopting a rather kind of hasty dogmatism. His desire for his mother. I mean, you have to ask yourself, like the crude analytic question, where does this coif of hair come from? Well, a lot of analysts will have no doubt in telling you, it's his mother. That's, the fingerprint of the Oedipus complex on. So, I mean, somehow this bizarre industrialist who's been spinning the story seems to know all this. Don't worry, that'll get him. We can imagine in what you might call a crude Freudian way, yeah, you could have predicted it. It's his mother. That's the missing term. from the kind of the plot, the narrative, the film, the cinematography. And indeed, it's there. I mean, I'm not trying to say that's, nor am I also saying that it's just wrong. It's just kind of not right. It's the mother. So we can see then that the space of the coif is actually the space which is encoded in the space of the vertigo. That is to say, the combination of going in and out at the same time expresses the contradiction between desire and its prohibition. In the case of the mother's coif, you know, that intimacy would have been at least represented by this coif of hair. And everything kind of that goes on the rest of the day. She goes to the bay, she appears to jump into the water. By this time, he's, you know, losing his heart. He rescues her. He says, the Chinese have a saying that if you save someone's life, you're responsible for them for life, right? The trap's sprung, he's hooked, he's in love. You might ask at this point, it's also very clear that Hitchcock provides a foil to this in the character Midge, played by Barbara Bel Geddes, who is, as it were, the person you should have fallen in love with. Intelligent, smart, independent, and clearly loving. That holds no attraction for him at all. Absolutely not. She's what you might call the girl next door, but next door is far too far for Scotty to get to. I mean, his unresolved Oedipus complex completely blocks next door. He'll make his choice from home or not at all. So you can see that, you know, that the space, either when he's on the roof or in the mission on the stairs, is a condition like for love, and also its impossibility. He has fallen in love with this, like, the repetition of the imago from his mother, and then she dies, or appears to have died. And he retreats into a kind of mute silence. Very interesting in the hospital, which sort of brings to a close, really, the first movie. Barbara Bel Geddes' Midge comes to see him, is clearly kind of touched and upset by the visit. She leaves, and she walks down a corridor, which is, so, you know, it's in the frame of the film, it's a rectangular corridor. It's actually, in a sense, the same space, but she has no neurotic element at all. She just walks down it. It's just a corridor. It's a corridor, and without the shot, which is the Vertigo shot. So, I mean, something about cinema and space is important because, of course, the cinema can do things which we can't do if we think like the psychology of perception is governs what we see, or we see what's there, you know. Once you begin to think of the senses as kind of affective organs, then we start changing the terms. I think we have to be very careful in architecture because there's an enormous wish amongst architecture students to be able to discuss space as a kind of an emotional issue. And that, of course, is entirely understandable. It's also very difficult because, you know, you can get yourself into a lot of problems in, you know, it depends what theory of, like, affect, what theory you take. I mean, I take this to be part of a long discussion about the relevance. Someone was talking about Dalibor. You know, it somewhat hangs on those. I said, the first half of the movie is a kind of presentation of a melodrama which could have ended there. Neither James Stewart nor we would, as it were, be any the wiser for what we're going to discover in the second half. The crucial moment in that is when we see Madeleine, or no longer Madeleine, but I can't remember her name, from Kansas, saying, oh, you know, she's writing him a letter saying, I'm not going to meet you. You know, I'm horrified that this moment's occurred. I was in a conspiracy with so-and-so to trick you. Now he's dumped me, giving me just a few jewels, etc., etc. But she doesn't, but we have been brought in to a subjective knowledge, which still, James Stewart's outside. The rest of the film is about gradually, this is brought to a kind of crisis, and at the same time, that crisis results in him suddenly knowing. At this point, we can be certain, to put it in a formulaic way, that, you know, one absolutely mustn't when talking about films, you know. After the end of the film, he's absolutely cured. And the symptom's gone. He is magnetically attracted to her, but we must be clear, only because she sort of looks like Madeleine. There's a kind of almost like healthy coarseness to her, which was quite absent in the sophisticated makeup and clothing. And indeed, the clothing becomes absolutely central. Indeed, his addiction to Madeleine, I mean, his focus, his love for Madeleine as an image, is so great that even when she's actually there, in the restaurant with her, he sees someone walk in, a woman, in a green dress, who suddenly, maybe she looks even more like Madeleine. I mean, she doesn't at all. You suddenly get to that moment, and as he does, no, she doesn't look like it at all. But his affective emotion, I mean, she's a good substitute, and then he wants to mold her physically to look ever more like Madeleine, but he doesn't think at this point that she is. Doesn't occur to him. Wouldn't occur to him. Madeleine died. Gradually, it's overtaken by this, in a way, tragic conflict between his trying to make her look more and more like Madeleine, sort of looking more and more like his mother. He forces her into an identical suit, grey suit, that Madeleine had worn. She rebels, like in character, because she doesn't want to be dressed up to be the person she had falsely been before. He leaves her to go back to the hotel with strict instructions about her hair. Even the vendeurs in the shops, obviously, kind of appalled by the sort of kind of damnably bullying way he's suiting her. Literally kind of suiting her. Tells her to have her hair dyed blonde, as Madeleine stroke Kim Novak had been in the first. When she returns, she kind of, he comes out of the hotel door and looks down the corridor. The corridor is kind of bathed in a strange kind of greenish light, and obviously Hitchcock must have took a long time teaching her to do it. She kind of sassays down the corridor. There's a strange way in which Kim Novak can make herself look quite kind of bulky without looking kind of overweight. What a trick. She now has everything but the coif of hair, which by now she knows. You know, if she goes as far as that, it's like the door will close behind her. She will be trapped in the person she was mimicking in the first half, or the person she was imitating, giving a performance as. He basically begs her, and she goes into the bathroom. When she comes out, Hitchcock does, for the second time in the film, what, as it were, used to be verboten in classic Hollywood, which is a 360-degree shot. It is absolutely astonishing. I mean, this was, pretty much, as a practical issue, banned from classic Hollywood. It is used in a most kind of extraordinary way, and then everything, for a moment, is consummated. After, presumably, making love. I don't know why I'm treating this movie as a piece of life. It's partly because I watch it about 2 times a year and have done for 50 years. I think it's an incredibly somber film of very great power. They're discussing where they're going to go and have dinner. She dresses, and it's funny, she's got these jewels on. And for the first time, he not only sees an object, he sees the story of how it got there. These are supposedly the jewels of Carlota Valdez. What the hell is this girl from Kansas doing with them? I mean, you have to treat it as like in a flash. So, in a sense, the function of these jewels is to reintroduce him to reality. For the first moment, he can think, or you might say, since it was his job, detect. What does the second half of the film tell us about the first half? Now, I've laid out with kind of crude dogmatism, you know, what you might call the old-fashioned, the traditional Oedipal interpretation. It all leads back to mother. Now, I think what the film knows in the second half is what, as it were, we still have to catch up with psychoanalytically. The Oedipus complex is not like a piece of history that happened to you, and so these are the effects. Let's say the real trouble, as it were, analytically, with Scotty, yes, you could say he has unresolved material, you know, with his mother. It wouldn't hurt if you say that like in a clinical seminar, but that's not quite the point. He's actually addicted to images. I mean, if the images go back to his mother, it's because they're images, not that it's his mother. The continuing play of the coif of hair, but you could think it could be something else, but it, you know, it goes in the same sequence. He's always going towards an object as if it were an image. And you might say, as it were, if we were to give Hitchcock a philosophical voice, it's not a kind of a whodunit, you know, where it's mother again. I remember my mother was a well-known actress who used in the 70s to endlessly go to auditions. She had been described in The Guardian as the world's obvious schizogenic mother. And she used to play these terrible parts of hideous mothers, you know, who drive their children quite crazy. It wasn't entirely untrue. But she finally threw the script back in the National Theatre. What have you people got? What's wrong with you? Why do you all hate your mothers? Well, it's sort of like this. I mean, that's the problem. It's about images. It's what he loves, but is disastrous for him, is the image. Now, of course, that leads on to the problem, who else is addicted to images? Oh, cinema. I mean, who are we to sort of tut at this poor man who's captivated by images, when what the hell are we all doing here in the cinema? Watching it. This is another part of, and I think, unacknowledged aspect of the film, without ever leaving the terrain of a narrative that carries us along. You know, there aren't all these directorial asides. Well, we're modernists now, so, you know, we know this is a film. It's while keeping within a traditional kind of space of a narrative, nonetheless, it's able to set off an unease about, well, first of all, about the characters. I mean, the industrialist who hires, as it were, James Stewart, as to follow the supposed Madeleine, his wife. Where's he got this incredible, like, story from? It's as if the industrialist is a really very bad scriptwriter. I mean, has indeed written the script that, in some sense, is acted out. And if you see when Scotty is going to his office, there's a rotund middle-aged man with a cello walking past the entrance, who, of course, is none other than Hitchcock himself. So it also raises the question, what's he doing? And surely, you know, we don't have to be an analyst to know that Hitchcock must have been aware of the extremely depraved thoughts that led him into being, at least in part, a film director. So, you know, what in sort of post-structuralist thought sort of became a celebration of like an internal sort of critique of itself is, you know, absolutely there 20 odd years before, without talking about post-structuralism in the Hitchcock, or maybe it becomes more available to us in a period when those themes are more public. What I've tried to say is, you know, it's two movies. The first is a rather fantastical, but nonetheless still functions as a melodrama, and is still sort of available to an equal interpretation. The second part of the film, which is a continuation of it, but also in some sense a kind of tracking back through it, and in some sense the undoing of the mythical aspects of it, to reveal someone whose vertigo is about the kind of addiction, not addiction, that's not the right word, the disturbance which occurs when we pursue an object in the form of an image, whatever it is. I mean, Christianity would be a tremendously good kind of field for that kind of part two. I've tried to say that what is particularly impressive is the fact that for Hitchcock, he's not tempted to go and write an article on, you know, the insubstantiality of truth or something, or problems with the Oedipus complex. He just does it, and it's, for him, it's partly a technical issue. That is to say, the shot, which must have taken, it's not that it's so complex, it takes courage and a lot of power to get that kind of solution. I mean, that is to say, he remains solidly within his art in making those points. They're not about commentary, they're not about intellectualization, they're just there. Cinematographically presented. I said, and then I'll end, that I thought, the strange thing is that the film is shot through, and I may be quite wrong, but I sort of think not. I think James Stewart was an architect. He walks into Midge's studio flat in scene 2. And she's working on there's a transparent perspex top of the body of a woman on which there's some new bra. He taps it with his walking stick, and he says, "What's this doohickey?" It's bra. She says, "You're a big boy now, you know about those things." She says, it's a bra. It's designed by a professor up the coast, there in San Francisco. He looks, he says. I hadn't made a guess. We've got someone to go and look it up. James Stewart's thesis is written on the cantilever, which is what the bra is. Barbara Bell Geddes, the name may set off an architectural memory or two, is of course the daughter, I think, of Norman Bell Geddes. Yes. There are these weird, there's a sort of series that they're not very consequential or deeply significant, but that is unusually peppered with slightly sort of architectural jeu d'esprit, because I think that the real question in all this is, how does love, including neurotic love, perhaps especially neurotic love, express itself like as a feeling spatially? That space, you know, it's not just I have vertigo, I get frightened. Most of us who have any feeling, we wouldn't say that we suffer from vertigo, but most small children have had the experience of being close, shall we say, to a cliff edge and becoming, in a sense, frightened of yourself because you suddenly find a strong wish to throw yourself over. I don't mean out of a suicidal desire, just a wish to do it. And then you feel yourself, you frighten yourself in doing that. So you have a kind of feeling in you, of absolute being pulled and pushed at the same time. The catastrophic desire and the kind of pulling back. I think, without being too autobiographical, I get this sort of in what I would call my stomach, is where I would locate it. But here we have it done through the camera, and I think it's an extraordinary version of that. So, I apologize both for being, if I had twice the time, I would have, made it, hopefully, a little less dogmatic. But, what can I say? This is 50 years of living with vertigo. Thank you very much.
I've given a talk on Antonioni before for Brian, architecture of spatial film, and I finished by wondering at that time if Antonioni were not, like James Sterling, a modern mannerist. I've been thinking a lot about this. I've come to the conclusion that mannerism, which English hate referring to in that way, it's really a substitute for religion in an age of non-believers. The word of God has become the word of man. Antonioni himself had always been a source of pleasure. He draws life and art together in a wonderful way. What is it about him that makes one so aware of simply being alive. In some way, the time of our living becomes part of the time of the film. L'Avventura, with Gabriele Ferzetti and Monica Vita, 1960, where, in the end, one doesn't know who's been lost and who's been found. Ambiguity writ large. The party of socialites on an outing to search a rocky island in an amateurish way, a spirited way, occasionally calling, Anna, Anna. Danotti, where with Marcello Mastroianni and Jan Morrow, 1961, where the conversation and the events appear utterly disconnected with each other, suggesting to me the presence of irony. We went to L'Eclisse at the National Film Theatre and enjoyed Monica Viti and the whole Antonioni thing, the wind in the branches, the paper in a tub of water, the thingness of things. Irony again. The Red Desert, the first film in colour, 1964, where a huge hull suddenly fills the back of the screen with no comment from anyone. This induces a sensation that what is happening in the film is due to unknown causes, to hidden agendas. These are not necessarily the same as the story we have been so far being watching, suggesting a possibility of contradiction. Blow Up, with David Hemmings and Vanessa Redgrave, 67, where the more the image is blown up, the less it tells us of what was there. Ambiguity, again, where the wind in the trees continues on and on, so different from Hollywood films, where everything lasts just long enough to tell the story. The last one we saw was The Passenger, with Jack Nicholson and Maria Schneider, 1975. We found it incredibly touching and moving. I looked at this once again recently. It's difficult to say what makes it so effective, if not an utter sense of the futility of all human contact. Perhaps he makes us simply slow down so that we live in the time of the film. Art has taken over life. It's worth thinking about this in some detail. What happened to the rhetoric? Where is the rhetoric in Antonioni? In writing, rhetoric is essential for communication to take place. Even more in conversation. It constitutes the shared part of language, and it exists also as part of ordinary life, as part of the everyday conversation. Like I said, or you know, or whatever. Charles Jenks speaks of unavoidable rhetoric. According to Roland Barthes, only poetry escapes rhetoric. And perhaps Antonioni is so poetic that he does simply escape it, period. Perhaps that's why so much of his writing seems disconnected. Certainly poetry, perhaps there develops an interesting stage in which the rhetoric of poetry is being extended. Certainly poetry, often examples, contains a lot of ambiguity, gives examples of that. In film, even when the overall attempt is to be realistic, rhetoric is usually brought back in by way of music. In watching your favorite soap opera, try cutting out the sound and see how empty the action becomes. It applies to almost everything we see on the box. One soon realizes that, for the most part, it is the background music that supplies feeling. I once asked Marguerite Duras at a presentation of her movies at the National Film Theatre, what about music playing? There are long, slow scenes where nothing much happens. We seem to be watching life, not a film. Music, she said, is absolutely essential. In Duras' film, music is part of the discourse. Even when it's quite raucous, which it often is, it poeticizes the scene. That's why she considered it essential. The Belgian filmmaker Chantal Akerman has a marvelous sequence in one of her movies. I think it's Les Rendezvous d'Anna, 1976. The camera never moves. It's focused on the stairs down leading out of a railway platform. Silence. Just an occasional motor. Then, the noise of an approaching train. It grows louder, and we glimpse it stopping on the right. Then a melee of people pushing and shoving each other on their way down the steps. Real time. Vivid. No music. By projecting the real-life scene in the framework of an art movie, she succeeds in imbuing reality with an ideological intensity and rendering it poetic. With Antonioni, it's different. He uses background music, but only occasionally. In La Ventura, for instance, we're almost halfway through the film before some background music is heard. But always, the soundtrack contains very accurately the sounds that belong to the scene unrolling. The rattle of a passing train, the pops made by drops of water, wind and trees, often quite different from wind and grass, very accurate. The background noise takes the place of background music. In the final scene in La Ventura, where Sandro, after a declaration of his love for her, has betrayed Claudia with a chance contact in the dining room of the hotel. We see him leaving the prostitute money. One is aware of something very like rhetoric in the way Claudia, clearly despairing, approaches him, sees that he is weeping, gently touches him, and attempts reconciliation, all without a word. And actions speak louder than words. I think Antonioni is suspicious of words. He wants to escape from words. That's why so many of his conversations seem disjointed. He makes them sound like background noises, for example. He wants to question the power of words. For him, words are often lies. True emotions are beyond words. It's almost as if words have become themselves the background music, often disconnected from the characters. I think that's why he's so aware of ambiguity in his films. In Christianity, the idea of heaven, hell, crucifixion, redemption, resurrection, the whole story of Jesus Christ, created a poetry of belief. Tension arose between the modesty of the Virgin Mary in her poetic form and the reality of the model used by the artist, often an attractive woman. In that tension we find today's worry. We no longer believe, but we need the reassurance that belief used to give. So, from the moment when Michelangelo discovered how style
could be used to compensate for loss of belief, becoming thereby the inventor of modern mannerism. It has become possible, where am I? Becomes thereby the inventor of modern mannerism, and it has become possible as an aim in life. It's a point of some interest that the high classical period of the Renaissance, for example, Bramante, lasted about from 40 to 50 years, whereas mannerism lasted for most of the 16th century. Later even, as with Borromini's Church of San Carlino alle Quattro Fontane, where a centralized church is elongated into an oval to satisfy the Christian tradition of the pull towards the altar. A clear case, in my view, of contradiction. In England, a mannerist tendency can be detected in many of the Jacobean playwrights of around 1600, like Webster, Dekker, Marlowe, mainly by their way of mixing gore and bloodshed with polite convention. Mannerism soon became a subject in its own right. In 1902, Max Dvorak lectured on mannerism at the University of Vienna. Walter Friedlander wrote Mannerism and Anti-Mannerism in Italian Painting around 1925. An English translation was published by Columbia University in 1957. In England, John Sherman published in Mannerism. The book was called Mannerism, Penguin Books, 1967. It discussed not just painting, but sculpture and architecture. Perhaps Palladio was the most prolific mannerist of them all, with an amazing variety of ideas. At the Villa Capra, known as La Rotonda, there are 4 porticos, one on each side of a square building. In classical architecture, portico indicates main entrance, front door. There's no need for more than one. Look at the Venetian church of Il Redentore, where we see a multiplicity of pediments, suggested only by their end corners, none of which correspond to the space of the nave behind. But it was an English architect, Nicholas Hawksmoor, who really adopted mannerism as we find it in all his churches, at St. Mary's Walnut, at Christ Church Spitalfield, best of all at St. George's in the East, at Wapping. Perhaps after Wren had used all the best sites, Hawksmoor was encouraged to be unorthodox by the fact that his churches were not so conspicuously cited. After Palladio and Hawksmoor, it's but a small step to reach Robert Venturi, his great book, Complexity and Contradiction in Modern Architecture, MoMA, 1966, and his slogan, adopted around the year 2000 Tristan era, mannerism, not expressionism. Colin Rowe was the one who brought it home to architects. With his essay of 1950, published in the Architectural Review, Mannerism and Modern Architecture. He emphasized the idea of the blank panel found in Palladio's Casa Cogolo and also in Le Corbusier's Villa Schwab at La Chaux de Fonds. I think he loved the ambiguity. But as the historian Howard Burns said, at both Casa Cogolo and Villa Schwab, the architects intended to display one of their own paintings. The real black panel was missed by Rowe. It's at the Laurentian Library in Florence, a square vestibule with 3 bays in each vestibule, all containing edicules, except the one that's opposite you as you come down the steps into that square thing to exit round the side, which itself is mannerist. However, it was Rowe who sparked James Stirling's interest, and he soon intended to do only mannerist architecture. His description of mannerism was, quote, a conscious imperfectionism. I believe mannerism is also part of the French novelist Patrick Modiano, his method of writing, with many breaks, changes of scene, ambiguities about characters in the stories. He was very interested in the polar, the French word for a detective story involving crime and punishment. The character of all such stories is to stress the ambiguity of fighting wrongs with other wrongs, intended to save society, therefore ultimately good. This brings us to John le Carré, writing under a French pseudonym, who writes such stories simply to entertain. John le Carré, a mannerist? In her very serious book, This Changes Everything, Allen Lane Penguin, 2014, Naomi Klein, a Canadian citizen, refers to the fiction of perpetual growth on a finite planet. Her warnings about the catastrophic effect of climate change may well have already brought about an underlying uneasiness in society. She printed a marvelous map showing all the points around the Sahara Desert where violence had occurred, all the places where the desert was expanding. There'll be more violence. Klein's subtitle is Capitalism versus the Climate. Capitalism won the Cold War, we would believe. Are we committed to it? And shouldn't we be doing more to combat the effects of climate change? There are those who take no account of that. Fossil fuels are still widely used in China, and Donald Trump wants to revive them in the US. We don't seem to realize the abyss over which we nonchalantly walk, the complexity and contradiction of our world, our innate dependency on doing what we're used to doing, form over content, just as in mannerism. It must be far more widely spread than we supposed. Thank you.
I think it should begin with an image of the Grand Hotel from the Hollywood movie of the 1930s. Is it coming up nicely? Yeah, good. Right. So, Grand Hotel, a little quotation that appears at the beginning and at the end of that film from one of the occupants. Grand Hotel, always the same. People come, people go. Nothing ever happens. Well, things do happen in hotels, including making films. But we'll come back to that. Let's just return to our question this morning first. Why should architects study movies? One reason may emerge from considering the difference between, let's say, engineering or technical design and architectural design. Technical design is done in what we may term an indicative mode of sentence, whereas architecture is designed in a subjunctive or conditional mode. The indicative is positive, binary, and binding. It follows natural laws which repeat. Repetition makes predictable, and so, in principle, determinable. Thus, from molecules, technical design proceeds to machines, from there is, or there is not, to there will be, or there won't be. Its motto, we might say, is fiat, let there be. Acts done in this mode know no freedom, no contingency. Design in the indicative, in fact, is designed to eliminate events, just as humanly speaking, there are no events in nature, just phenomena. The subjunctive, whereas, deals not in what is and what is measurable, but in what might be, or may be, or would be, or could be, or perhaps should be, or ought to be. Its métier, I will say, is the mightlyhood. I know Nigel knows this word. For as a likelihood is likely to happen, a mightlyhood or a maylihood might or may happen. I've adapted these from the word Möglichkeit, the German for possibility. And another word that you might connect with this is the word potential, which I'll come back to later. The motto here, itself subjunctive, would be if, as invoked by W.H. Auden in his poem, The Birth of Architecture, where, concerning nature, he says, among its populations are masons and carpenters who build the most exquisite shelters and safes, but no architects, any more than there are heretics or bounders. To take umbrage at death, to construct a second nature of tomb and temple, lives must know the meaning of if. Thus Calvino's novel, If on a Winter's Night, opens a cascade of overlapping stories. And when the Liverpool Everyman reopened in Howard Tompkins' new theatre, they started with Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, which commences, if music be the food of love, play on. Like stories, plays, and movies, works of architecture are composed beyond the goals of purely functional order by mightlihoods, representations that elaborate flirtations between determinacy and contingency, and in such negotiations rehearse conditions for free actors, not just in plays or movies, but on every stage throughout life. When Hannes Meyer, second director of the Bauhaus, an exponent of Sachlichkeit, an architect who was better than his words, claimed that design is function times economics, he revealed himself as being, despite himself, rhetorical, when he followed it with a feigned sarcasm. Who ever heard, he asked, of the design of a dock? It's enough to make a cat laugh. Yet docks, like railway stations, are not just machines. They're places, like hotels, where events happen, or more exactly, where men and women enact events in actual time. An architect knows that a school, a hotel, or even a dock or a station is not just a building, and not just the rules that regulate it, but all the human events and all the time that will pass through and within their walls from beginning to end. This is what films, documentaries, or fictions can remind us, and have done so since Lumiere recorded the arrival of a train at a station. I should perhaps give them the title, by the way, of this talk, which is Plan, Program, and Plot, and a subtitle, Toutes les années, or every year, all the years at Marienbad. I'm interested by these three words because plot, plan, and program can be in time or in space. In Lumiere's first film, The Train Arriving, we see an engine approach, then wagons. So far, we're only seeing mechanics. But then, when they stop, doors open and crowds emerge, fill the platform, and fan out, each towards their own stories. In that emergence, we see an event that might be the start of 100 movies, but an inception, too, of possible architectures. When Lumiere's team visited Liverpool, they filmed a tracking shot of miles of such sites along the docks. One shot, however, is a mystery. A deserted dock. The only motion seen is steam rising from the side of a boat, from a slowly tracking camera. Why was it shot? Nobody knows. It's just a part of the stock that's collected in the museum. It is enigmatic, as if waiting an arrival or lingering after some departure in a story that Lumiere, the documentarist, would never try to tell. There, at the dawn of cinema, decades before Antonioni or Tarkovsky. It offers nothing but time, traced in that entropic wisp of steam into a void. Yet in that void too is a germ of architecture, a mightlihood, because we cannot help but propagate it with imagined narratives, each entailing not just dead time and void space, but conjectured, projected into specific timing and definite spacing. It was, I think, that the indeterminability of such narratives that led Bernard Tschumi to study film as a means to deconstruct the idea of an architectural program. In 1957, John Summerson, receiving an RIBA medal, gave a lecture, The Case for a Theory of Modern Architecture, where, seeking what he termed a source of unity, the focus at which an architectural design is realized, he was seeking this to replace formal imitation and to crystallize a functionalist essence for architectural modernism. He adopted a Beaux-Arts term, program, from Guadet, Julien Guadet, defining it as a description of the spatial dimensions, spatial relations, and other physical conditions required for the convenient performance of specific conditions. But Summerson discerned a problem. He wrote, the conceptions which arise from a preoccupation with program have got at some point to crystallize into a final form. And he added, but there is no common theoretical agreement as to what happens or should happen at that point. There is a hiatus. One might even be justified in speaking of a missing architectural language. Now, 1957, I can imagine how a young, hearing Summerson, a young Cedric Price might have reacted. If form, he would think, still less final form, was not fittable to programs, programs, moreover, which in an open society will always be wanted to people wanting to alter, then forget form. Price's Fun Palace, a flexible facility for public service, would be reprogrammable, like a computer. Others took an opposite line, noting that functions, like guests at a grand hotel, come and go. They are, thought Aldo Rossi, for instance, what architecture, the architect of the city, always, simply, and exactly is. To this polarity, Tschumi brought another tack from situationism and from Georges Bataille via cinema. Finding, like Summerson, no sure link from function to form, he turned again to Guadet's definition, and he cites its original terms, rather more sophisticated than Summerson's, I think. An architectural program, it says, is a list of utilities. It indicates their relations, but suggests neither their combination nor their proportions. But Tschumi returned, he said, as if to a forbidden field, where renewed concerns for architectural events have taken an imaginary mode. This mode Tschumi would name, with his unit Diploma 10, the discourse of events, when he and Nigel Coates mounted in 1983 their show of AA Diploma 10. Likewise intriguing to Tschumi was what he called a critical affect, arising in cases where, as he said, ideal building types were displaced into new programs alien to their original purpose. Programs might now become, Tschumi thought, vectors of transgression and disjunction. What had been discounted in rationalist and formalist dispositions, and what situationists had sought to recover in tactics like détournement and dérive, might now, Tschumi thought, be recovered in design as cross-programming, trans-programming, and disprogramming. And techniques for these Tschumi found in films, in montage, and in the exorbitant acts of their stories and characters. As one of his advertisements for architecture declared around a movie shot of someone pushed from a window, architecture is defined by the actions it witnesses as much as by the enclosures of its walls. To really appreciate architecture, you may even need to commit a murder. Note the may, a maylihood. But we need not plunge into the Bertaian agonisms of Tumi's manifestos to see an affinity of filmmaker and architect. In that encounter, we might find an echo of the angel man and human woman in Wings of Desire. Oh, there wasn't meant to be sound, but never mind. Each has something that the other lacks. A film director films a city. Thank you. A director films a city whose verity consists in uniting characters, actions, and milieu. But this verity is only fiction in imagined time. Therefore, the director envies the architect who builds for real. The architect makes a city whose reality is a coherence of mass in space, but which can never intervene in living events, nor even guarantee their future. The buildings, like indifferent gods, remain spectators to the unconcluding narratives of their citizens. Architect and storyteller look upon the other with longing, desire, envy. Both long for what they lack. The filmmaker moves in time to embrace space. The architect's tectonic span reaches out for time. From their desires for an impossible alteric supplement, they make their representations, their art. One director went so far as to make buildings the real subjects of 3 of his films. That director was Alain Resnais. The buildings were a death camp, Auschwitz, a library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and a hotel. And the films were Night and Fog, All the Memory of the World, and Last Year at Marienbad. Now, those who know these films might hear demur, for the first 2 were certainly documentary essays, but surely, they might say, the subjects of Marienbad were X, A, and M, the unnamed trio, 2 men and a woman, whose anguishes torment its 90 minutes, 100 minutes, I think. But the opening passages, themselves showing passages and corridors, are accompanied by a voice-over that repeats just as the motifs and mirrors repeat and reflect themselves. The voice is that of Albertezzi, the character who the actor plays X. Yet its mesmeric iterations, wandering between past and present, speak not in the temporal logic of a story, but as if from within a synchronous loop that traces the labyrinthine dispositions of a place, a phantom hotel that, like a library or a prison, distills several characteristics of what Michel Foucault would call a heterotopia. Consider that voice. A voiceover usually narrates or guides a direction. Information films that aim like a textbook to be positive and objective are indicative statements. A documentary, whereas, is already an essay by and of a subject. Its themes already assuming the subjunctive condition of motifs in a history, which is to say, a story. In a documentary, the document is lifted, we might say, from the obscurity of an archive into the role of a motif. This is done by voice and vision, by commentary and by kinematography. In Night and Fog, voice and vision are most parallel in tracking shots that scan the camp of Auschwitz as it is now, a museum site. They use a side scan, which is to say, the camera goes that way and the view goes that way, and so it scans laterally. A side scan is like a scroll that unfolds to reveal a survey or an architectural section, rather like the section that Nigel showed before. It is a third-person review of what extends in time and space. Its implication is epic. In this use of the continuous scanning, Resnais's technique parodies the meticulous documentation which he shows was done by the exponents themselves of the final solution. For when the for whom the systematic elimination process scarcely differed from the chemical fabrication of plastic that Resnais filmed in his other documentary, The Song of Styrene. There is throughout a relentless and ironic insistence on regimes of order and system, insanely repeated, from ranks of soldiers to ranks of blocks to ranks of corpses. In his next documentary, Tous les mémoires du monde, All the Memory of the World, about the Bibliothèque Nationale, what is striking is how this irony occurs again and is transformed and intensified by the way that Resnais changes his tracking shot to a first-person view that paces relentlessly through the library as if in search of something lost amid an unfathomable maze. So the first-person view identifies with the track of the camera, just points forward, like your own eyes. And I think that kind of shot immediately brings in a kind of subjectivity and identification which does not occur in the side shot. Indeed, the opening section of Resnais' film, with its lugubrious music running through an attic full of, or a cellar full of books, recalls that of Citizen Kane, which roams over heaps of Kane's detritus, while reporters search in vain for the meaning of rosebud. Tous les mémoires du monde has been described as an essay on the potential and limits of dutifully archived human knowledge, masquerading as a documentary on the organization of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Tous les mémoires approaches the tone one of Georges Bataille's sardonic entries on buildings and institutions in his glossary in his journal Documents, which Denis Ollier wrote extensively about. The film even shows the numismatic department where Bataille worked. Only at the close of the film does its tone lift, as we see an item emerge as if through a mirror, he says, from the stacks to the reading room. This was actually shown this morning by Penelope, where for its reader, this threshold becomes a door, the book becomes a doorway or a threshold to a mysterious happiness. And that phrase, as if through a mirror, is very interesting because it's sort of like Alice in Wonderland. Alice, through the looking glass, goes through the mirror and everything's the opposite. And Michel Foucault, in describing his idea of the heterotopia, begins with the example of a mirror of reflection as something other that's there. It's perfectly formed, but it's not here. I see myself where I am not. And of course, last year, Marienbad is absolutely full of mirrors. Tous les mémoires demonstrates how films can reveal aspects of films and places that are rarely apparent in the usual architectural plans, sections, and models. It shows the library's program not as an inert program, but in actions whose aims to order lead to questions as to those programs' motives, yet which seem doomed to futility. If an archive is a library or a museum that is yet to be catalogued, indexed, and brought fully to a system, then that project is shown to be here in this film, like Babel, the Tower of Babel, sublimely unfinishable. This is a documentary that puts into question the very impulse to documentation itself. Yet perhaps that infinitude is precisely the wellspring of that mysterious joy that the film discovers in the study room. Perhaps because the unfinishability of study is what guarantees the freedom of the mind. Might be, that might be, it may be. That's another likelihood. Where human events are concerned, documents in themselves cannot represent any fact but their own actuality, just as a camera cannot actually record anything but the light that enters it. All moves beyond that must be interpretation. A film editor is one to whom this is most evident, for he knows, as Resnais, who began his work as a film editor, knew, the implications of the Kuleshov effect, wherein altered sequences of the same shots produce different interpretations. Last year at Marienbad, the effect is played out in sight and sound. Shots, scenes, monologues, and dialogues recur with variance in both content and sequence. The voiceover sometimes not matching what we see, or the scene arriving only after its earlier commentary or description. Shots show what is assumed to be there now, whenever now is, what was there then, usually at some several past moments, and what is imagined by someone to be there or said to have been there. Marienbad is a suspense movie. One brief shot suspends an image of Hitchcock in a shadow, haunting the hotel. But suspense hangs here, not on what will happen, but on what might be said about what happened last year or somewhere. That something is, in Hitchcock's terms, a MacGuffin. It's a bit like the electric herd that gets the greyhounds chasing. And we are kept in suspense. We never do learn what happened, nor even at the end what might happen to X and A as they wander off to lose themselves forever in the night. Of both their origins and fate, the film's ending concludes, only that its indecision is final. In consequence, as a resolution to X, A, and M's story is suspended, attention moves to its setting. It is evidently set in a hotel, but it is also set within a fiction film. Roger Ebert, film critic, described Marienbad's manipulations as those of an author in writing a story. Can it be that X, he writes, is the artist, the author, the director, that when he speaks in second person, "You asked me to come to your room," he is speaking to his characters, creating their story? That first he has M fire a pistol, but when he doesn't like that and changes his mind, M obediently reflects his desires. Isn't this how writers work? Creating characters out of her and then ordering them around. I find this quite plausible. Marienbad is indeed a reflexive work. It's a modernist work in Shklovsky's formalist terms. It foregrounds the devices of its own artifice, although here they are those of a film editor rather than a writer. At many points, one can sense the reeling and halts of René Steenbeck moviola machine, the editing machines that editors work at. But reflexivity entails form. The writer of the story of Marienbad, Rob Grier, said of his discussions and collaborations with René, "As long as the kinds of form were agreed on, we'd be able to think up the subject." And in a 1977 interview, René said, "There can be no communication except through form. If there is no form, you cannot create emotion in a spectator." I suggest that what gave form to René's decisive indecisions was that the story is set in a hotel, which, like the ship that Foucault cites as the best example of all of a heterotopia, maintains a state of dislocation and temporal suspension for its inmates. This abstraction may induce in them a strange focus upon their own stories. Think of Lost in Translation, for instance, which may be concluded only once they leave. In this, hotels resemble prisons, which are, after all, but compelled hotels. Not my hotel, it's your hotel. René's camera roams through his hotel as if through Piranesi's cartieri, and many indications imply its occupants' inability to escape. They seem to become the building, like the statues around it. But I'd say that they are effects of the building as much as the reflections of its many mirrors. Foucault's first example of a heterotopia is indeed a mirror reflection. And we first see X staring into a mirror, not at himself, but at a scene across the other side of the room, where he's looking at a couple act out a scene which actually is almost identical to the scene that he's going to act out for the rest of the film. The interesting thing about a mirror, of course, is that it is a variant of a special kind. It reverses lateral space. And there are many variants in this story. Consider them. The alternative paths, the returns and flashbacks, each one a kinematic heterochronie, because as Foucault points out, for every heterotopia, there's a special time to go with it. And that's a little bit like the chronotope, which I described in the introduction, that Bakhtin has discerned in narratives. And they're all imagined in the same hotel and garden that holds all in the same time. Now, while a building admits of lateral and vertical alternatives, sideways, up and down, backwards, and passages either way through a door or a corridor, a movie sequence, even flashbacks, can only go forwards. But Marienbad has ways of deploying time as if in a synchronous array, as if in a plan. They are most apparent in those tracking shots through the occupant's passaggio along a languorous salon, where in a single take we see M in one room of enfilade and then again in the next, where he, with X he plays the game of Nim, pulling out the pins, which X always loses. There's no Kuleshov effect there. And further along, as we move along, we overhear people, each seeming to tell stories as if from different years. One person is overheard saying, actually, it wasn't so extraordinary after all. He'd started the whole thing himself, you know, so he knew all the possibilities in advance. In this freeze, or freeze, in both senses of the pun word, or frozen freeze, movement is but repeated circulation. We come here every year, and likely at any moment actually to freeze, as we overhear it said it happened in 1929 or something. And as we see the audience halt at the close of a clockwork-like performance of Ibsen's play, Rosmer. All these are clues left hanging, like facets in a cubist painting, that connote but do not commit to exact relation. The nearest architectural equal was probably Marcel Duchamp's door at Rue Larrey, which opened one way as it closed in another. He put the door in the corner of a room so that it slammed shut and opened the other door. It was just one door for two entryways. So I think it's the closest thing to real cubist architecture I've ever seen. It's a perpetual indecision. A cubist facet, we might say, is a synecdote, a representational fragment in space, much as an anecdote is a representational fragment in time. In Marienbad, we might say that anecdote has become synecdote. It is a place where, as in Beckett's play Endgame, time has become space and there is no more time. Now, around 1960, there were in France writers who sought to avoid subjective motives and expressions in fictions by turning narrative plots into spatial plots, as in graphs, tables, or matrices. One was Raymond Queneau, who wrote in Alexandrines the voiceover for Resnais' film The Song of Styrene, and who was a founder of Oulipo, the Ouvroir de Littérature Potentielle, a workshop for potential literature. I suppose the English acronym would have to be WOPOLIT or something. Among its members were Georges Perec and Italo Calvino. Its aim, the seeking of new structures and patterns which may be used by writers in any way they enjoy. And its favored method was that of constraints. Well, what is a wall but a constraint? And despite all of those no-walls fantasies of the open plan and dreams of perpetual and unlimited dérive in Constance New Babylon, walls and their concomitant rooms and corridors will surely remain not only objective necessities, but subjective desiderata. That, I think, was the gist of Bernard Tschumi's advertisement, Ropes and Rules. But among Oulipo's methods, what intrigues me the most here are the turns from temporal to spatial strategies, which offered ways of multiplying variant alternatives. Just as in a building or place, one may proceed in different ways. Indeed, in a labyrinth, in all too many ways. Perek's Life, a User's Guide, used as its plot, plan, program, a chessboard night tour through a 10 by 10 grid of rooms in an apartment block as its kind of narrative roots. While Etienne Lecroix set a cartoon strip into an infinite loop Möbius belt, and in another work, set within a 16-square grid, a 15-frame cartoon strip, a comic strip that could be altered. Note that Resnais was a lifelong collector of comic strips. They could be altered Kuleshov-wise to variable narrative sequences. So it's a kind of machine for producing Kuleshov effects. Now, Resnais was a devoted collector of cartoon stories, and surely asked the question as to who really invented montage, the filmmakers or the cartoonists. Moreover, in his later works with Alan Ayckbourn, he cast his stories into Oulipo-like grids, tables, and systems with plots and programs like building plans. His film Smoking, No Smoking, adapted from Ayckbourn's Intimate Exchanges, was a double film that, starting from the same scene, titled How It Began, followed 6 possible variants, mightlihoods, we might say, consequent upon seemingly trivial decisions. Now, there's one thing I've not written in this text which I'd like to add because I think it's important. There's one way of thinking about all of these bits and pieces of stories in Marienbad, which is to imagine it as a kind of Kuleshov effect in reverse. In a Kuleshov series, you start with a coherent narrative and then kind of reshuffle it into something that might be surreal or Dadaistic. But supposing you collect a whole lot of separate fragmentary stories that you never know the full gist of and never see the end of. You just collect these bits and pieces and assemble them into a film. I think that that's kind of one of the things that Resnais does. But who would be in a position to do that in a hotel? Well, I submit that it would be the staff. Because in a hotel is a heterotopia with 2 sides. It's got a front of house, back of house. There are the guests, yes. You and I are only there for a week or 2, but they're there for good, forever, for a long time. I mean, anyone who's gone, I mean, every year I go to the Hotel Calcina restaurants in Venice, and I notice that, some of the waiters have been there several years, and I'm just there as, wow, it's so great. But for them, it's every day. Now, I'm not making some kind of socialist critique here. I'm simply observing the phenomenology of this, because their experience of that place is entirely different from mine. I could imagine that you could collect overheard fragments of stories of some couples who are breaking up, some couples who don't get it together, some couples who do, various other. And, if you were to, it's like as if walls had ears, in other words, if buildings could speak. So that's one source of it. And the other is this general possibility that architecture offers that you can go either way. You can open that door, or that door, or that door. I could even get out through the window if I was a Bernard Tschumi character. But you can't do that in a narrative. You can only go on and on and on and on. I mean, I know there's any number of writers who try to evade this, but the fact is one page follows after another. Now, these conditions could be pursued. But to end, I'd like to return to Marienbad to raise the plane somewhat, in fact, to that of myth, and that's one reason why I was very pleased that Nigel used that word a couple of times. It seems that in much modern art, I'd say, formalizations, stylizations, mannerisms, abstractions, and even simple repetitions often conduce to ways of re-encounter with myth. This is evident in the florid genres of popular film, all those sequels, prequels, and where even bad films circulate as a kind of common story. In Marienbad, I think it emerges among the multiple and contradictory interpretations which it incites. Does it, as it has been suggested, relive how Ibsen's Rosmer persuades Rebecca to escape social confinement by plunging to death together, itself a rather mythic gesture? Is it a variant of Orpheus and Eurydice, a thought perhaps suggested by a sculpture in the garden that is focused upon, and then deflated by M's prosaic explanation that it's just some historical scene? Or, if A is Eurydice, maybe we may sense in her resistance to X's ardor a wish actually to remain where she is in Hades. In Gluck's opera, she seems at first reluctant to leave the Elysian fields. Her chorus girls sing, "In so faithful a husband, thou wilt find another Elysium." To which maybe she thinks, "I'm not so sure. Orpheus was a nice guy enough at first, but that damn bloody harp. And as for the groupies, don't get me going." Maybe Eurydice begged Orpheus to turn back to look at her because Hades was precisely where she wanted to be. Turning around and going back is something that you can do in space, but not in time. So while films pile up proliferating myths like Cain's loot and the uncountable books in the store basement of Resnais' libraries, perhaps this capacity, this potential, this mightlihood for accommodating opposite and contrary variants and directions is what architecture can offer to film. As a coda to this conjecture, I'd like to read out a passage from Roberto Colasso's wonderful account of myth in his book, The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony. Myths are made up of actions that include their opposites within themselves. The hero kills the monster, but even as he does so, we perceive that the opposite is also true. The monster kills the hero. The hero carries off the princess, yet even as he does, we perceive that the opposite is also true. The hero deserts the princess. How can we be sure? The variants tell us. They keep the mythic blood in circulation. And bear in mind what a key word circulation has been in architecture. But let's imagine that all the variants of a certain myth have been lost, erased by some invisible hand. Would the myth still be the same? Here one arrives at the hairline distinction between myth and every other kind of narrative. Even without its variants, the myth includes its opposite. How do we know? The knowledge intrinsic in the novels tells us so. The novel, a narrative devoid of variants, attempts to recover them by making the single text to which it is entrusted more dense, more detailed. Thus the action of the novel tends as though towards its paradise, to the inclusion of its opposite, something the myth possesses as of right. The mythographer lives in a perpetual state of chronological vertigo, which he pretends he wants to resolve. But while on the one hand he puts generations and dynasties in order, like some old butler who knows the family history better than his masters, you can be sure that on another table the muddle is getting worse and the threads ever more entangled. No mythographer has ever managed to put his material together in a consistent sequence, yet all set out to impose order. In this, they have been faithful to the myths. The mythical gesture is a wave which, as it breaks, assumes a shape the way dice form a number when we toss them. But as the wave withdraws, the unvanquished complications swell in the undertow, and likewise the muddle and the disorder from which the next mythic gesture will be formed. So myth allows of no system. Indeed, when it first came into being, system was no more than a flap on a god's cloak, a minor bequest of Apollo. Thanks.
What an enjoyable afternoon. And I learned a lot. I kept seeing sort of odd connections between things. For example, the thing about mannerism as substitute for religion, of course, I mean, it's an obvious enough point, but the decline in church attendance, certainly in Britain, which was well underway by the mid-19th century, and a small minority of people were still regular churchgoers at the start of the 20th century, but my God, didn't people flock to cinemas? And I think that history of the heyday of the cinema in the 20s, 30s and 40s, it was a twice-a-week experience in the biggest building you were likely to experience, bigger than certainly most parish churches, if not quite as big as cathedrals. And then that set me thinking about just the word cinema, which has always had that lovely kind of double-loaded thing, because when we say cinema, on the one hand, we can mean cinemas, a cinema, my local cinema or whatever it might be, but on the other hand, we mean film. And I think, therefore, that's what gives such huge power to those wonderful films like, you know, Cinema Paradiso. Why is that so powerful? Because actually it's about both, quite apart from the backstories and the narratives of the people themselves who are actually part of, you know, a filmic script. So at this point, you're getting so many sort of layers of history of kind of cinema, of cinemas, of the relationship of people to cinemas. And I think that's why this is such a sort of fecund subject for discussion. And the only other thing I would say, quite by coincidence, is that I went to a launch this morning at the Finnish Embassy of two buildings that are part of their Year of Art and Architecture in Helsinki. One of which is a new central library, and of course we've seen the Wings of Desire plus the sort of documentary about the French library are just a reminder of that other huge built form, now rather unfashionable in the sense that books like newspapers are apparently going out of business, though they're not really. But the power of the library is still immense. So Helsinki is getting a new central library, but we assume there won't be too many books on display. They'll be in warehouses out at the back, or they will be kind of, I think only a third of the library will be about books and 2/3 will be for other more general purposes. But the other building that they were sort of semi-launching today, which will be completed later this year, is a building called Amos Rex. Amos being the Swedish or Scandinavian pronunciation for Amos, and this is a man who died in 1961, very, very rich and apparently quite unpleasant capitalist, who did, however, leave a lot of money to a cultural foundation. And his collection of art, which previously was in his own house, was unsuitable for display purposes. So to cut a long story short, they have taken a courtyard next to a 30s building, and they're putting a brand new space, which will be a sort of Möbius strip thing with no columns, domed roofs with light wells in, and this is going to be the big new cultural centre. Now the Rex, which is appropriate apparently for this man, because he would probably looking down from hell or heaven or wherever he is thinking, yes, Rex, that's the right word for me. Rex is actually the name of a much-loved cinema in the middle of Helsinki, a 1930s modernist steel and glass building which was supposedly going to be temporary but was so successful and popular that eventually, not that long ago, the people writing the city plan managed to get this building preserved so it would be there forever. And the reason why Amos Rex is in the courtyard at the back is that it did not want to destroy the building itself. So this cinema, which has been out of action for at least a couple of years, will be restored to its full glory. So you will have kind of art exhibitions below ground with some spectacular kind of top lighting, or not, as the case may be, but you're also getting this sort of glass palace restored to glory. And the final bit in this little jigsaw, guess what the big opening show is going to be at Amos Rex? And the answer is Team Lab. that most cinematic of kind of, you know, cultural production. This will be a scale that they've never done before, and that will be in this extraordinary new place in the middle of Helsinki later this year. So as you can see, sort of, it's not exactly last year at Marienbad, but all these sort of little things were sort of going through my mind, having arrived here slightly late, I'm sorry to say, because of this opening, about all the content that has come through. So I have no right to be at this table, but that's my contribution, and thank you very much.
Very good, very good.
I think,
By the way, when I first went to the cinema in my hometown, it was called the Picture House. And it was some time before they got anything other than silent films. Tells you how old I am.
this outfit that you've just described, I mean, it's clear that they're one of a widespread tendency that relies on improved forms of projection. Now, this goes back to Richard's talk right at the start, public projection, because it's clear that, I mean, something started to happen when new kinds of lamps came out that you can project into places that are not enclosed cinemas. I guess the quasi-situationist artist Krzysztof Vertigo was one of the first people to really exploit this, where effectively he could completely transform the iconography of a building just by turning the switch. Like when he was in London, he projected a swastika onto the cornice of the South African High Commission or embassy, as it was at that time. It does something to the sense of what the reality of the building is, if in fact part of its continuous sort of use and appropriation is that in fact it becomes a screen for the deposition and the projection of virtual images. And I dare say we'll soon be into a situation where we can kind of program entire walls, which would mean a complete return to new forms of figuration not seen.
Well, occasionally you do that on the side of the National Theatre, don't they? And it, you know, it turns in. I'm surprised it doesn't happen more often. But the thing about conventional cinema, which has always struck me as interesting, this other relationship between architecture and film, is that the nature of the film is two-dimensional. Yes, we can put visors on now, but let's say that what I like about the film is the fact that it is, as it were, on a flat screen. And I like the fact that it's sort of defined by its time, however jumpy that time might be in the film itself. But you see it in circumstances, you see it in architectural space. Let's say you see it in volume, in a volume, where your time is entirely linear and it's just, you know, boring old Euclidean, you know, it starts at 6:30 and the film ends at 8:15 and that's it. Even though on the film you might be getting 150 years or 10 minutes, you know, from 60 different perspectives. And I've always thought that's one of the absolutely fascinating things, apart from the sort of cathedral or church-like nature of going to the cinema, and those rituals, which are not so common now, but I mean, Pearl and Dean was always like the sort of parish notices, wasn't it? And then the sort of really crappy little local adverts for bars or Indian restaurants. So that I rather miss them now because you don't seem to get them very much. But I do think that relationship between architecture, which is there and solid and sort of fixed for that moment, and then this absolute mayhem or not, which is happening on that screen in front of you, that's why it's sort of magical, and that's why it was so addictive to those people who would go to the cinema twice a week for decades and decades and decades. And we all know that actually the circumstances in which you watch the film have a very profound effect on you. And I think this, not remarked on very much because perhaps it's so obvious, but we all know that it's an absurdity to watch certain films on a television screen. I mean, why would you bother? Things that have been made actually for physical environments, you know, rather like sort of, you know, the abstract boys wanted to do huge paintings which couldn't fit into normal domestic circumstances because they were designed for huge cultural buildings in exactly the same way that filmmakers make films for certain things. And people I'd love to have heard John Mabry talking about this difference between cinema and television, about what another occasion perhaps, but I mean, what are the differences when you're deliberately designing for a small screen where you're assuming that most people will be watching it in domestic circumstances? Is this a consideration? I've never made a TV, I really don't know, but I'd love to hear about that.
I think it is because if you look at it, the thing that mostly distinguishes film from television is that in television, the people being filmed are often aware of the camera. When you gave that marvelous picture of a lady peeling potatoes, and she goes on, and I'm hoping to God she doesn't look at the camera, and she didn't. And that made it what was for me real, whereas if she'd looked at the camera, it would have spoiled the whole thing. Yes?
But I think Netflix has changed this. Because the one thing I would observe is that the production values that are going into things now that are commonly watched on you know, I don't go to the cinema to watch something that's been made on Netflix. There's episodes and episodes and episodes. You do it in the comfort of your own home, don't you? But actually, the production values and the skill are the equivalent of what has gone into, you know, really good filmmaking for as long as anyone can remember. I think that's a really transformative thing, and it has very little to do with architectural space.
I wonder if it's got anything to do with the French love of what you call bande dessinée. In the bande dessinée, the author can decide from frame to frame how he shows, close up or hard up or a perspective view down and so on. I currently enjoy very much reading about Alex Enoch. I think it was a fellow called Jean Martin who wrote the thing. And there's also, of course, Tintin and all that stuff, and the bowler hats. Belgians have always been keen on bowler hats. Chapeau melon. But you never see Maigret depicted in film with a bowler hat. No way. That would be to put it all behind the past, be out of the way. So there's a question of, in my mind, about the difference between our society, which is so saturated with television, and the film, which shows up a pre-television life, maybe a realer life.
Final point for me, because I don't know about you, I'm feeling rather thirsty.
Yeah.
But it was your thing about, is it the script the staff wrote in the hotel? I think is a very interesting observation. And it reminded me of Muriel Spark did a volume of short stories, or a novella and some stories, called The Europeans, written around about the time when we were actually going into the EU rather than coming out of it. And there's a rather horrific sort of opening novella which deals with precisely this subject, which I recommend if you like.
I think that repetition, or let's say a kind of network of repetition with fragments hanging in that network, is an interesting formula. One of the first jobs I did here was with Nigel when he asked me to take students to Liverpool. And he wanted to go to see the set for Brookside, the soap opera. And it turned out that really was interesting was that they'd actually bought real houses and put little holes in the walls for the cameras. And it seems to me that the model of something that goes on repeating but then varies each time is an interesting one. maybe it's the form that myth can take at present. I mean, anybody who's been in a cyclical situation, like teaching in a school every year, I go through the same routine, and for me, it's a routine. But for the students, it's entirely new. Their stories is entirely different. And I'm sure every teacher knows that you meet people who say, oh, don't you remember me? So, sorry, I didn't. But the student always remembers the teacher, but the teacher doesn't remember the student. Point is that in these repetitions, there are rather like in the gaps between the points on a grid, there are variants. It seems to me, for instance, I can imagine that if Scheherazade was writing her story to save her skin today, she wouldn't write Scheherazade, she'd write a soap opera. I've just come back from a cruise in Norway, or along the Norwegian coast. And I went in the same boat on the same week as last year. I think one of my friends was here who went with me. And it was very strange because the boat kept exactly the same schedule. Most of the crew were the same, although a lot of the waiters in the restaurant were different. But the types of people were sort of the same, but different. Each had some kind of story. Some of the repetitions were really uncanny. There was one morning, for instance, where the ship docks at the town of Harstad very early in the morning, and last year I came out on deck after just getting out of my cabin, and we were just coming out of the harbour. And I did the same this year, and we were exactly at the same point in the harbour, same weather and so on. And I was trying to think, well, what is it about these industrially reproduced and repetitive situations that nevertheless admit a continuous flow through them that produces a certain kind of mesh in which some sort of lives are captured. It's like as if the architecture might be the mesh of those repetitions. But in between them, there are variants. But I'm sure, I mean, Francois' wife is dealing with that all the time. But I think you're right. One of the repetitions is drinking. So thanks very much for everyone, patience and endurance. And I'd like to go up to it. Well, it's something I wanted to do for a long time, and we finally did it. Thank you. Bye.